AMD's RX580 has a legendary reputation, but the problem is they did release a 4GB version of this card. So the question is today, if you ended up with a version that's only got half the VRAM as the full-fat version, is it completely obsolete in 2026? Right, now this here is my RX580 4GB. That's right, it's the one that everyone seems to be buying at the moment because this is the cheap one. I got it as part of a cheap bundle from this Intel X99 mess that is still sitting on my desk. But given that lots of people are still looking at buying the RX580 4GB, and it has some, well, rather heavy VRAM limitations, I want to actually plug this into a proper PC and find out if it's completely obsolete. Now, I did do a little bit of basic testing on this X99 setup because it came as part of this cheap bundle, but the problem is, well, I mean, look at this setup. Even as I'm taking it apart, it looks as janky as it was. So we're going to put this in an actual Ryzen gaming system and see just how well it performs. So let's clear this off the desk and plug it into a real computer. Despite being a 4GB version, this is actually one of the nice ones with RGB and needs an 8-pin and a 6-pin, which just seems so excessive for Polaris. Not as bad as an RX590, but hey, it's still annoying regardless. This one was water damaged, so you never know. There's a chance it could still be a bit funny. I don't think it will be because we've cleaned it and it was working fine for at least 48 hours. Now, one of the primary points of today's video is of course to find out if this is obsolete because of its 4 gigs of VRAM. So we're going to set it up, we're going to get a baseline score, and really we're going to get straight into the benchmarking because hopefully this is the last time I'll be looking at the 4GB RX580. We've covered the 480 and now I've got this annoying cable to try and tuck out of the way. If you are running an RX580, all I've gone ahead and done is install the latest drivers. They're still getting quarterly bug fixes and optimizations from AMD, so they still work fine, but as you can see down here, we are running the latest drivers that are dated the end of last year, start of this year. They had an update in January. And if you are running one, well, one of the first things you're going to want to do is to undervolt it, because not all of them are set up as nice as this lovely Sapphire version is. So if you are someone with an RX580, then I am just going to quickly recap how to undervolt. So if you bring up your drivers, you go to Performance, bring up Tuning, you want to go to Custom Tuning, agree to all this. You want to bring up your power limit to get the most out of the card, which isn't going to make too much of a difference because what we're doing is mostly stability. And usually what you can do is just grab Power State 3, which for us is 1100, and you can copy and you can paste this all over. So then if you run that, apply changes, you have a built-in stress test. What this will do is it's not going to cap our overall performance, but it will make it a bit more stable because it won't be hitting a power limit, and it will bring down our power consumption. Because with this setup like this, we're still hitting our 1400 megahertz clock speed, but our power consumption is now down to just in and around 100 watts. We will be touching on power consumption later on in the video because, once again, I don't really want to ever cover the 4GB RX580 again, but it's something people constantly ask me, and you know what? Sometimes it is worth covering these cards because the demand for them. So simply by doing that, this card will now be quieter, cooler, and more stable in terms of frame rate, while still delivering pretty much the exact same score. So all I'm going to do for the sake of stability is run it through 3D Mark and just get some baseline scores. I mean, really, I've already done a lot of testing on this from the last video that is probably completely relevant because, well, the RX580, and one of the reasons it's so popular is because you can pair it with virtually anything. Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, Ryzen like this, X99, X79, even X58. Pretty much anything that can still launch modern games is almost an ideal pairing with the RX cards. They've got low driver overheads, they still get drivers, they're quite power efficient when they're not just left with their out-of-the-box settings. Honestly, they're just a really solid card, which is why they are in such high demand pretty much all of the time. I think general prices on these are in and around £30. I'll throw up some listings now, but I've seen them still sell from anywhere from £25 to £35 for these cheaper 4GB versions, and then anywhere from sort of £30 to £50 for the 8GB versions. Now, buy it now prices and CEX prices on these are a bit of a rip-off. These were in and around £30 to £40 on CEX would have now gone up to around 50 quid since the start of the year. Lots of people have been very amazed that I've still got examples like this cheaply, but the deals are there. Just sometimes you will be taking a risk on options that may be 4 parts, or you'll be having to wait till the end of an auction hoping you get a bargain. But we're just going to let it run through 3D Mark, see what kind of results we get, and go from there. This looks fine. This looks exactly the same as when I was testing it earlier on an X99 setup. It's only really a problem when you start running into VRAM limits, but of course we will touch entirely on the world of tuning, 3D Mark progression, synthetic testing. We're going to be quite comprehensive today. So pretty much the main reason for undervolting is if you see these little bits here with the clock frequency and the memory frequency, it just keeps them stable the entire time, so we are seeing no drops in and around, and our power consumption is nice and low, which also means that our temperature peaks out at 60 degrees. The problem with Polaris is that they are inherently a very efficient architecture that AMD was just insistent on ruining, so they just kept shoving more and more voltage into it for the sake of a couple of frames. Most of them will just undervolt as easy as that. But one thing I do want to do real quick is see if it will launch a brand new just released game, because I was playing a bit of it last night and I kind of want to see how it's gonna run. So if we bring up Samson, because this is the first game I've seen out that doesn't list a Polaris style graphics card as the entry level to being able to play it. And I'm kind of curious if it will, well, even launch. I'm assuming it is going to because it already has. But it's Unreal Engine. You gotta remember, this is pretty much a brand new game out, and I've not seen it run on anything. So I feel like this is a pretty relevant test for a little RX 580 4GB, is can you just launch a brand new game out and will it work? Well, it's good to know that it does apparently just straight up crash. Let's try again real quick. Yeah, it's crashed again. Please provide feedback. I was benchmarking an RX 580 4GB. Please help. This is not the point of the video, but I have discovered the INI file and I wanted to try something to see if we could get it in-game. Now, does it actually make it in-game now? No, it's crashed again. Yeah, I'm guessing this game just has issues with Polaris at the moment. Still, we tried. Anyway, carry on with the video. I just wanted to see if we could get it to do something, but unfortunately not. Now, I'm not going to waste time delving into the history of the RX 580 4GB. All you really need to know, it's a rebranded RX 480, but with 4GB, which already had its own 4GB version, so it is just a straight rebrand with more voltage pumped into it that you can quite easily fix, and we will be touching on why you do that in just a moment. Specifications-wise, it is based on GCN4 being the Polaris 20 XTX variant. As mentioned, you get 4GB of GDDR5 memory, running through a 256-bit memory bus. In terms of power, it is decently powerful with 2,304 cores, 144 TMUs and 32 ROPs. Drivers are reduced down to quarterly updates, but modded drivers are available, but they mostly benefit things like GTA Online and Counter-Strike, and not so much legacy or older titles. In terms of modern game support, I'd imagine there will still be updates to get things like Samson running, but still, time will be the deciding factor there. You do, however, have full DirectX 12 and Vulkan support, and as I said, it is more or less just an RX 480 4GB. I've seen these examples sell from anywhere from £20 to £50 in working condition, and I have seen options that are available for parts go cheaper than this. You'll also quite likely find them in bundles that are a few years old, like my X99 one I grabbed, where really this was just sort of a freebie that came along with the rest of the package. Now, I have gone ahead and undervolted this card and got a load of synthetic testing done just to show a comparison against other cards and of course the full 8GB version. Kicking things off, we have stock versus undervolted, where we did gain a few points here or there. In terms of actual gameplay, it's more of a stable frame rate than it is an overall increase to the average, and this is just free performance for virtually any AMD Polaris card. In fact, it's just free performance for virtually most AMD cards because they are very overvolted from the factory. In terms of its progression across the benchmarks, we see that in older DirectX 10 titles, over 78,000, absolutely fine. DirectX 11, also not really a problem, not exactly Polaris' strong point, but it still does well here with over 15,000 points. TimeSpy and Steel Nomad go on to show the strengths of DirectX 12 on these cards in lighter or earlier titles, but the full-fat Steel Nomad really does go on to show the problem with these types of cards. it simply doesn't have enough VRAM to be able to offer you any substantial degree of performance. However, for most people that are looking into the RX 580 for lighter games and older titles, well, the 4GB pretty much performs the same as the 8GB. It's between a 1063GB and an R9 Fury, which is sort of where it's always been. So it's bang in the middle of pretty much my graphics card chart, showing pretty much the average level of performance you should expect. It's not going to compete with a Vega 56 or a 980 Ti, but then again, these are still a lot cheaper than those are. However, I have been compiling some more data, and in terms of Steel Nomad, which really does seem reminiscent of a lot of those heavier titles out there, think your Oblivion Remastered and those heavier Unreal Engine 5 titles that are relentless on VRAM, well, we see that it really does suffer here, scoring 3 times less than the full-fat RX 580 8GB. In fact, it still scores around half of an R9 Fury with the same amount of VRAM. You've got to keep in mind the Fury does have HBM, which is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, but this graph just goes to show that lacking in VRAM, well, it can be quite detrimental to performance when you start getting to these newer benchmarks, and likely those newer games. I think at this point though, we've pretty much said everything we need to say. We've got the card set up, I've given a basic undervolting tutorial because people were asking how do I undervolt specifically an RX 580. It's the same for most AMD cards, but if you want a lazy way of doing it, the method shown here will work on virtually all cards, so you've got nothing to worry about there. In terms of testing today, I want to test a lot of modern titles, I want to test a lot of popular titles, and then in terms of additional testing, we have got some Linux bits coming up later on because this is a Polaris graphics card and they have arguably better support over on Linux these days than they do over on Windows, but that is coming up later on in the video. But the real question is today, we've seen the RX 580 8GB, we've seen it perform great, and that video is still gaining traction because people just want to know how it performs. But it doesn't change the fact that one of the comments that people still ask underneath even just recent videos is, how is the 4GB version doing? Now, I have tested the 4GB RX 480 just before Christmas, but of course, people still search for the 580, not realizing it's the exact same card. So we are testing it today, and I've been very thorough with testing, just to make sure that I don't have to do this again, at least not for another few years. So anyway, how is the RX 580 4GB performing, and is it completely obsolete when we throw it up into the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which we ran with very high settings, but textures set down to just high. But we've got to remember we only have 4GB of VRAM, and you can mitigate this a lot of the time by simply just turning down the textures and masking it with very high settings and, shaders and bits and pieces like that. We returned 64 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 54 FPS. At the end of the day, despite being the more limited Polaris card, it does deal with DirectX 12 exceptionally well, so there was no problems here whatsoever when it came to GTA 5. Moving on to the world of online, and we retained the exact same settings we were using, and saw our average increase up to 66 FPS, which is to be expected. There is a lot less going on. Our 1% lows did suffer slightly, but not really enough to notice unless you're someone that monitors the frame rate the entire time you're trying to play a game, now seeing 1% lows down to 50 FPS. This is certainly an increase over the results we saw on our X99 setup, where we had odd issues with frame pacing that were nothing to do with the card, and were in fact down to the likely janky setup that we had running. So at the end of the day, GTA 5 runs perfectly fine. I will briefly touch on the results for GTA 5 running with the Legacy version, where it ran absolutely fine both single player and offline. We ran it with Ultra settings plus AMD CHS shadows. I'm not going to focus too much on the results as they're not taken from the Ryzen system today, they are taken from the X99 setup, but generally when you're talking older titles, which isn't really the focus today, we do a little bit later on, that is going to be fine on an RX card. I just want to get it out of the way that if you're playing games of its era, well, this was designed to perform almost like the flagship back then. I mean, it wasn't a flagship, it was a mid-range card, but it matched things like your R9 390, it almost matched your R9 Fury in certain instances, so yeah, when it comes to games of its era, not really a problem whatsoever at all. Now, the RX580 has always served a great purpose of being one of those cheap cards you can buy to get into playing Counter-Strike 2 decently competitively. So with competitive settings, which is low everything and dynamic shadows enabled in a 1080p resolution, we returned 248 FPS throughout the built-in benchmark, with 1% lows down to 179 FPS. Overall, a really decent showing, and goes to show that the RX580, even in a full HD resolution, has still got plenty to give in Counter-Strike. However, if you move to the 4x3 resolution that is very popular, 1280 by 960, we see our average increase up to 298 FPS, with 1% lows down to 237 FPS. So yes, it works perfectly fine here, and arguably even better in the popular 4x3 resolutions. Moving to more popular maps such as Nuke, more intensive maps such as Nuke, will result in a hit to the frame rate, now averaging anywhere from 180 to 220 FPS, purely because, well, they are more intensive, they do have more assets, and they will get you closer to using all 4GB of VRAM, so they do suffer more here on these 4GB cards, but not enough to stop them being playable. Next up, we have probably one of the best optimized Unreal Engine 5 titles out there with Arc Raiders. It's decently new, it's very well optimized, and it is fully playable on an RX 580 4GB. You can run the game with high settings, but you will have to turn the textures down to low, and there will still be some degree of pop-in in places, which, to be fair, I'd prefer over stutters. You can see the sort of textures merge in towards you, which is something that doesn't happen on an 8GB version of the card. We run the game with 1080p in its native resolution, no upscaling, no anti-aliasing, nothing like that, and we returned 44 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 35 FPS. However, some people will be interested in running the game with FSR, and it is a fairly good implementation here. So with the exact same settings and FSR set to balance mode, still in 1080p, we now return 58 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 49 FPS, which arguably was smoother to play, and to be fair, FSR in this game doesn't look too bad. So Arc Raiders, really I'd say use FSR here if you don't mind, but still, you can play it in a native resolution if you really want to. Cyberpunk is one of those games where lots of people just say it's not playable on these older 4GB cards. I have no idea why people are saying that. We had it literally running on a 1GB card, so we've proved it can be done. And here, well, it wasn't a problem whatsoever. With a mixture of medium and high settings and texture set to low in a 1080p resolution, and this is a figure taken from actual gameplay, not the built-in benchmark, because, well, it's not exactly reminiscent of real gameplay and gives you a result that's far too high, especially on these lower-end cards. So in terms of actual gameplay, we saw an average of 36 FPS, with 1% lows down to 30 FPS. And keep in mind, the textures, they weren't really too much of a problem. The game still looks pretty good with these settings, and with the effects turned up to medium and high, it does mask a lot of their downfalls. And if you were interested in achieving a higher frame rate, once again you do have a decent implementation of FSR3 here in Cyberpunk, and you can turn this up to the balanced mode, and this results in a very nice improvement, up to 54 FPS on average, with 1% lows to 47 FPS during the exact same types of gameplay. Really, the only area that you will see a lower frame rate in Cyberpunk is when you're going really fast through the city, because, well, it's quite intensive, and is when the card, well, just has to provide more than it can really give. At the same time though, it never stopped being playable, so Cyberpunk, an enjoyable experience, either in native resolution or with FSR on the 580 4GB. On the other end of the Unreal Engine 5 spectrum though, we have Oblivion Remastered, which when you've got a great graphics card and you can handle all its VRAM requirements, is a great looking game. But the problem is, on the lower end of the spectrum, well, things do suffer, and that is something that seems to be inherent with a lot of lesser optimized Unreal Engine 5 titles. We did get the game playable with low settings, FXAA and screen space reflections enabled, in a 720p native resolution, and to be fair, with a locked 30 FPS frame rate, which I did externally through MSI Afterburner because it is a lot more reliable than the built-in frame rate cap is, you could get away with playing Oblivion Remastered here on the little 4GB 4GB version of the card. However, when you compare this to the 8GB version, which can handle this in 1080p with a few options set to medium, it really does go on to show, well, the downsides of this here 4GB model of the card. Some people are probably wondering, why don't you use FSR? Well, FSR does have a degree of VRAM overhead, which of course in a game like this where you're already banging on the full 4GB, ends up with the game being a bit of a stuttery mess. I did try and capture some degree of a benchmark with it, but the result was just so unreliable and unplayable that it's not even worth giving you figures for, because you can see with your own eyes, well, it's not something you're gonna want to play. Next up though, we have BeamNG, which we ran with the high preset in the jungle map with traffic enabled, which really is sort of a quite VRAM intensive scenario to put this card through, given it's having to deal with the extra assets and models for the traffic, as well as all the draw calls for just being in the jungle map. It is quite an intensive area, but one that does make up for it by actually looking remarkably good. This was all in a 1080p resolution, and to be fair, we did return an average of 48 FPS, with 1% lows down to 41 FPS. After traffic had just spawned in, it could take the frame rate just a couple of moments to stabilise. It was all done within a minute or so, but you could get a few hitches or stutters, but still, this went away quite quickly. So high settings plus traffic isn't a problem in one of the more intensive maps, meaning that most of the easiest scenarios in the game will definitely see you in and around 50 to 70 FPS. So BeamNG, not really a problem even if you only have the 4GB card. Lots of people always request to see Red Dead Redemption 2, despite the fact that it is always a pain to benchmark, because one of the main limitations of this being a 4GB card isn't how the game runs, no, it's the settings menu, because having 4GB means that, well, it's a bit of a pain to actually tweak it around, so I just left it with the default settings that it launched with, which was medium and high, and textures set to ultra for some reason. Apparently that's just sort of the one way you can have them so they don't look terrible. Someone told me that, whether or not that's true, someone will have to tell me down in the comments. But still, it ran absolutely fine with these settings. Red Dead tends to be pretty good at choosing its settings on cards like this, and we returned 58 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 50 FPS. So there wasn't really any problems here. The game did look absolutely fantastic, and I'd say settings-wise, you're looking at about on par with probably an Xbox One X, just you're not running in 4K, you are running in 1080p. So I've not really got any problems or criticisms here. Red Dead 2 ran absolutely fantastically. Next up we have PUBG, which to be fair we did see earlier on in the week on our X99 setup, but I just ran the game with its default settings and DirectX 11. If there's one big advantage to Polaris, it's how well that it does deal with DirectX 12, and here in PUBG that's no exception. Running the game with high settings and low textures and the DirectX 12 render option enabled in 1080p, the game would stutter during your first match for a couple of minutes or so, likely while it's compiling shaders in the background. It had just had an update, so I'd imagine that was likely responsible for it, but once these had disappeared, the game nearly ran a completely locked 60 FPS with no problems. If you enable AMD Reflex or disable AMD Chill, it's something like that in the drivers, it will disable the frame rate cap here, and you would likely see a higher frame rate, but at the same time, the game was very happy and the card was seeing nearly full utilization at all times in and around this mark. So for the sake of your average and your frame times, really DirectX 12, the 60 FPS cap that comes with it in place, and you're looking at nearly a full 60 FPS experience in a game that once struggled to run on virtually everything. Next up we have Fortnite, and most people have told me all they care about in this game is achieving the highest possible frame rate they can get. So with low settings and DirectX 12 in a 1080p resolution, that's pretty much exactly what I set out to do. And to be fair, we did have a really good time with 128 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 88 FPS. If you didn't mind targeting near 60 FPS, you could turn up a few of the effects and likely the textures as well, but still, Fortnite, no real problems here. It runs best with DirectX 12 on these cards, at least in terms of frame rate stability, which is certainly something you do want here. So Fortnite, I've not really got anything else to say about it. I mean, it achieved a frame rate in excess of 100 FPS as an average, even on the little 4GB card. I doubt with these types of settings there'd be any disparity between the 4GB or the 8GB model, because we purely aren't using enough effects here, but still, Fortnite ran fine, and I'd imagine a lot of people looking for a cheap graphics card that'll run it. The RX580 4GB is probably one of their first ports of call.
Next up we have M&B Bannerlord, which of course defaults to the best settings it thinks the card can use, and it's no exception here that on an RX 580 4GB, it ran itself with the high preset and medium textures in 1080p. Once again, just to reiterate, the built-in benchmark is very reminiscent of the late game, so this pretty much guarantees that for a lot of the early to mid-game, you'll be seeing an excess of 85 to 100 FPS a lot of the time. Even though this benchmark is rather intensive, we still returned our 85 FPS average, and our 1% lows down to 59 FPS, while the game was looking remarkably good. Battle size also scales with the settings that are used here, so this is also worth keeping in mind that you can run the game with larger battles without having to turn down those settings, and still not have to worry about your 4GB of VRAM getting filled up enough to make the game stutter. So M&B Bannerlord, it runs excellent on most AMD cards, and the 4GB RX 580 is no exception. Next up we have Fallout 4 with the Anniversary update, which has certainly brought some improvements to modern cards but has made the game more VRAM intensive, which could be a problem for the RX 580 4GB. But was it? Well, the game defaulted now to high settings rather than ultra, which is something I wasn't expecting to see because for the longest time pretty much every card defaulted to ultra and ran poorly because of it, but it actually picked the right settings here, returning 60 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 56 FPS. Some people will likely be saying, oh, but if you're achieving a locked 60 FPS here, why aren't you running the game at ultra settings? Well, you can, but if you look at our GPU utilization in the top left, in standard Bethesda fashion, it is all over the place, and moving up to ultra settings, the utilization is still all over the place, but results in a much less stable frame rate. So if you're looking to enjoy the Anniversary version of Fallout 4, high preset, it looks great, it runs great, and there was no problems with frame times, which was nice to see in a Bethesda title. For anyone wondering about how this card deals with Source games, we have Black Mesa, which is arguably as intensive as the Source engine can get, at least Source 1, so not the newer version of Source, the original version. So think your Half-Life 2, your Garry's Mod, your Team Fortress 2, your CSGO, this is pretty much as intensive as the engine can get. With Ultra settings and DirectX 9 in 1080p, we returned 121 FPS and 1% lows down to 87 FPS, which is a really good showing here, given this is in the Zen level, which is one of the more intensive areas in the game. So generally for a lot of the early to mid game, when you're in the smaller, more enclosed areas of Black Mesa itself, you'll be seeing an excess of 200 to 400 FPS. It's only when you get to these Zen levels that it really puts this level of stress on the card, and the RX 580 deals with it fine. It has very good DirectX 9 support, so for those older titles, no problems whatsoever, and for those Source titles, also no problems. An absolute abomination of a benchmark, but one that is always heavily requested given its popularity on Steam day to day, with Rust. Now, Rust is one of those games that's received frequent updates over the years and has become much more intensive because of it, especially in terms of VRAM requirements. We ran the game with high settings, but we did turn our textures down to quarter quality in a 1080p resolution, just to retain a degree of the frame rate. Even then, we were still getting very close to that VRAM limit, but I didn't really want to drop textures much lower than this. Still, it was going to show that Rust is playable on the system, and you can have some of the eye candy turned on. If you turn the settings down to low, I'm sure you could achieve well over 60 FPS, but for the sake of actually putting some load on the card, we are running it with those higher settings. Still, 44 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 36 FPS. The world would take around 20 to 30 seconds to load in, which is something that wasn't present on the 8GB version of the card, but still, can you really fault it? This is the cheaper version with 4GB, and if it still returns you a playable frame rate, does it really matter that much? With the latest release of Hitman's benchmark map Dartmoor, we were able to run through it with high options enabled, but we did turn our textures down to the lower options. We also had the simulation quality set up to best, which puts a decent chunk of extra load on both the processor and the graphics card. It is not purely a processor-bound option. This was all in a 1080p resolution, and we returned 69 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 54 FPS, which is a remarkably solid frame rate, and remarkably solid frame times, given how intensive the Dartmoor benchmark map can be. Still, at the end of the day, this is a DirectX 12 title, and Polaris does, as we've seen, deal with DirectX 12 really rather well. It's one of the reasons it's aged so well, and I struggle to think of it as a card as old as it is, because it is just so good at dealing with these newer titles that use DirectX 12. So Hitman, no problems, and the visuals look pretty good as well, because they masked a lot of the problems with the lower quality textures. It's been brought to my attention, given how popular City Skylines is as a benchmark on this channel, that there is actually a fix for the notoriously low frame rate. It turns out that upwards of 10,000 times a second, the engine it's got a bug where it tries to update all of these UI HUD elements, putting loads of strain on the graphics card for some unknown reason, tanking a frame rate always around to sort of around 15 to 30 FPS, and it's doing this around 10,000 times a second apparently. Still, there is an FPS boost mod, which is really just a UI fix, which makes this now playable again. So with high settings, we were entirely GPU bound, but we did return 55 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 44 FPS. Within the mod settings for the UI fix, I did cap it at 60 FPS, which did help make the frame time smoother, but it was nice to see City Skylines actually running at 1. High settings, 2. A 1080p resolution, and 3. Near 60 FPS again. So City Skylines works fine on an RX 580 4GB, just remember to install their FPS boost fix, which makes sure the UI isn't killing your graphics side performance. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? We're actually going to test the remaster here today. Well, with a mixture of medium and high settings in 1080p, we returned 92 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 74 FPS. And given how good this result is, some people are probably wondering, hang on a second, why aren't you just running with high settings? Well, moving up to high settings in this game does look absolutely gorgeous, but does tank the frame rate quite heavily, and also brings up the VRAM requirements substantially as well. So Crysis Remastered, you can deliver really decent visuals, but you are going to have to tweak the game around with medium textures and a few of the more VRAM intensive options on medium, and then a few of the post-processing effects and the less VRAM intensive options turned up to high, but still, you're going to see over 90 FPS a lot of the time, and this was during some of the intensive sections. So Crysis Remastered, well, even with 4GB of VRAM, the RX 580 is dealing with it with no problems whatsoever. So, overall performance of the RX 580 4GB, and you've got to keep in mind, most people, they're going to be smart enough that they're going to take a look at this and go, well, I will just try and get an 8GB version. But there are people all over the world that may not have the luxury of that being an available option, or it might not be something they can afford to wait around for, so they're just looking at the 4GB version and wondering, is it enough? And I think for a lot of people that are shopping in this end of the market, where they are playing a lot of these types of titles, well, it's only when you start getting into titles like Oblivion Remastered that you really see that there's no way around it. There's no optimizations on the VRAM, it wants more than 4GB, and it lets you know it because 720p in a native resolution is about the best you can do. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's still plenty of titles like Arc Raiders, where you can enjoy high settings, but with lower textures, and you can still play it in a 1080p native resolution on your 4GB version of an RX 580. Lots of the popular titles out there on Steam seem to work absolutely a-okay. Would I say to get a 4GB version of the 8GB? No, definitely not. It's not worth it. Just get the cheapest 8GB version you can, and at least then you've got that little bit of a buffer, which will definitely come in handy in future titles, which we're already seeing in things like Oblivion Remastered, and even Cyberpunk and Arc Raiders, where you can enjoy them with higher quality textures if you're playing them on the 8GB version. But for your average person, do I think this is bad? No, I mean, for a 25 quid graphics card, you can still play absolutely everything out there, and I don't think that's something to be scoffed at. No 4 gigs of VRAM isn't great, but it's not the limit as much as you think it is. Honestly, drivers are more of a limit than the VRAM is, because look at something like Samsung, which does apparently work on cards like the 1050 and the 1060, but doesn't work here on the RX 580. It should. Whose fault is that? Maybe it's the developers, but maybe AMD needs a driver update to make it work. Who really knows? When it comes to the thermals of the RX 580, they don't tend to run too hot because most have really rather overbuilt coolers, and unless you're getting an early blower version, which I think they stopped when they ended the 400 series, you're going to be seeing pretty decent thermals out of the box. I've not cleaned the thermal paste on this one, but it still runs pretty good, and to be fair, I don't think it's had much use, which is why it performs so well. To give you an idea, as a worst case scenario, during firm arc under stock voltages we saw 81 degrees, but generally with our Undervolt applied, we saw the card pretty much hover in and around the low 70s, which was absolutely fine. A more interesting point though is power consumption, because of course the RX 580, Well, it can be a bit of a power hog, especially when running Firmark, which is where the max power figure is taken from. It acts like a power virus and is very, very intensive on these GCN cards. Even with our Undervolt, we were in excess of 184 watts, but generally while gaming we were in and around the 150 watt mark, which is what you'd expect from Polaris. General usage and idle, the card doesn't really have to do much, and the power states are set up quite well at the lower stages that it doesn't use much power. But if you were wondering, and this is one of the more popular parts of my power consumption test, if you could run an RX580 on a cheaper, lower wattage power supply, you can bring power consumption into and, well, in and around the sort of 60 to 70 watt mark. Generally it can be lower than this if you cap your frame rate at 30 FPS, but if you're aiming for a 60 FPS experience with some heavy undervolting, we were playing GTA 5 here in 720p, completely maxed out with the Enhanced Edition, and seeing a locked 60 FPS that returned us a power consumption figure of in and around 50 to 70 watts, depending on what was going on. Usually it was in and around 60 watts, and well, this is the point I'm getting at. Polaris was inherently a very efficient architecture, and you can really claw a lot of that power efficiency back if you were limited by your power supply, which is one of the reasons these cards are so popular. One feature that does usually go amiss is the AMD drivers. Admittedly, they probably could use a few more updates than they're getting here, but then I suppose Nvidia's offering sort of the same tier of updates for their Maxwell cards and their Pascal cards, so you can't really blame them too much. When it comes to driver features, you do get a lot of options. AMD FreeSync works, AMD VCE works, which is a minor point to touch on, and I'm sure I'll throw up some footage because you can either use the built-in Relive recorder or use it via OBS, and this is a Black Mesa recording taken from earlier on in the week using the RX580 graphics card. It's nothing amazing, but it'll do enough to get by for handbrake, OBS, and maybe some light media acceleration. In terms of the driver side features, well, for older titles, it is quite nice that you can run with integer scaling, which is where the graphics card controls all the scaling and you're not dealing with stretched pixels and bits and pieces like that, and you also get advantages like forcing texture filtering at higher quality options, as well as super sampling, so I decided to load up Morrowind, and to be fair, when it comes to retro gaming, I do think these Radeons have a degree of an edge over Nvidia with how easy it is to make a lot of these older titles not just work, but look absolutely fantastic while they're working here. It's also worth noting with the 8x super sampling running here, it was actually putting a surprising amount of load on the graphics card at certain times, even with a frame rate cap in place. So it's nice to see that you can do quite a lot of retro gaming, and lots of those retro games will work fine on these cards with these drivers, something that I have noticed is a problem on some of the newer Nvidia side problems on some of the newer Nvidia side cards. Take Crysis for example. You can't launch DirectX 10 on most Nvidia cards that are running the most up-to-date drivers. Here on the AMD side, well, it works absolutely fine. So for retro gaming and a few extra driver side features, yes, you do get those here on a Polaris graphics card. And 4 gigs, it's not really going to be a limit when you're talking about games this old. Now, I did want to touch a little bit on the Linux side of things, and there's a members video going out where we actually put Linux on my main PC, which is how we're running CatchyOS on my proper computer, because I decided, you know what, finally we're going to do it. We're actually going to put Linux on my computer and start including some more detailed Linux testing. For the sake of today though, we have managed to get Linux all installed and running, but the reason I wanted to do this was to see if we could actually make Samsung work, because I thought, you know what, it doesn't work on Windows, there's nothing I could do tweaking wise that would get it to work, and given this is a brand new title out, maybe, and there are people saying this, there are certain games that won't launch on Windows on these types of cards that will work on Linux, given you do get excellent driver-side performance. Unfortunately though, despite the tweaking I did and moving around different Proton versions and still making my own config tweaks, it's still an instant crash. Now this could be due to the game developers, but apparently there are a lot of games that do gain a certain degree of advantage when you run them here on Linux, and I am going to set up properly for testing that. For the sake of testing today, I'm mostly just going to tell you how it was, because in terms of the Linux experience on an RX580, it is pretty much flawless. Virtually any distro you use is going to work particularly well. CatchyOS has also just come out with an update, which really does apparently help the stability on a lot of these lower VRAM cards. I'm sure I will be testing that in the future, but for the sake of performance today, well, generally you see pretty much the same performance in titles like GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, where we saw a slightly lower average here on Linux, but with the exact same settings we also saw, well, pretty much better frame times overall, so arguably to me this felt a bit smoother to play over on the Linux side of things. When it comes to titles like BeamNG, it actually did run better on Linux. It's only a few extra frames here or there when it comes to the average and the 1% lows, but still, it's free performance. I'd done no tweaking, this was without running any Undervolt, and we were seeing better than Windows performance. And of course, you will get a lot of titles that will work absolutely fine. So I ran the MasterChef collection, and we saw that run at a locked 60 FPS with the highest settings, 1080p, and absolutely no problems. So it's not exactly the most in-depth Linux testing today, it's more anecdotal, but it's just letting people know that, one, I am moving towards Linux testing that is going to be more in-depth, and two, well, this card is perfect for Linux, so if that is something you're looking into, definitely consider it, because performance is great over on Windows, but is arguably more stable, if not better, over on Linux these days. So is AMD's RX580 4GB obsolete in the year of 2026? Well, it is getting there, isn't it? Let's be honest, when it comes to newer games that really don't have the best VRAM management, like those, like Oblivion, you're just looking at an experience that's 720p and it's not exactly all too great, and you don't have enough VRAM that FSR's going to come to your rescue. But then again, in terms of actually being a bad graphics card to buy, I think for a lot of people that are just looking to whack this in a cheap system and they can pick one up for 20 to 40 quid, well, you're going to struggle to find something better than this. The 8GB cards have gone up in price, same with the 6GB 1060s, leaving these 4GB RX580s in a real bit of bargain bin territory. And I think the performance we've seen today, no, it's not as good as the 8GB. Yes, the 8GB offers you more longevity, and yes, modern games are getting to the point where they're not launching, but that's not to do with VRAM, that's to do with the architecture of the card, and possibly driver support or developer support. So it is in a bit of a weird situation. I think what I'm going to say is, if you're someone looking for a cheap graphics card, the 4GB is fine. Try and get an 8GB if you can, but if you can't, the 4GB, you'll get decent enough performance. For most people, this performance will likely be fine on the 4GB card because they're going to be able to play lots of the popular titles out there, and it's enough to get you by, especially if you're playing over on Linux where, to be fair, it's arguably an even better card. So, yeah, it's been a bit of a weird one. I'm going to say that, yes, time is definitely limited for the 4GB RX580, but for probably this year, you're just about safe to get away with a lot of popular titles. So thank you all very much for watching. This isn't a video I planned on making, but I got the graphics card for free as part of my bundle, and so many people asked me that I thought I'd finally get it out of the way. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and good night.